forget how long I had. It was only about 10 days or so. And then I had to go back to Southampton. And when I got back to Southampton, I went to the jetty where the Leopold should have been. It wasn't there. I got hold of one of the dock workers there, or wharfies, and said, I'm looking for the Leopold. Do you know if she's in any of the other docks? And he said, there she is. And he pointed out to sea, away from the dock area, and there, coming up the Solent, was the Leopold. So I was the only one there waiting for her. And the Leopold came into her berth where I expected her to be, and she'd been out on an exercise whilst I was still on leave. Early in 1944, the Leopold was dispatched to the Western Isles of Scotland. We were working out of Oban. The islands we passed regularly were Mull and Coll and Egg and Muck. They've got some quite attractive names, the islands in the Western Hebrides of Scotland. But we were training with commandos on a live ammunition course, or training ground, battleground, that was in Loch Sunot. There was quite a nice sandy beach there with land on either side. You'd sort of go into this loch from the sea, and we had to land on this beach, and the full length of the beach had barbed wire entanglements and landmines that were very light in explosive power, but if a commando trod on one, it would explode and maybe give them a wee bit of a shock. So they had to get through that. While they were doing this, there were live ammunition being fired around them and over them, and the bombers used to come in and drop bombs at the back of the beach as we were landing the commandos. And we used to do the landings in daylight and night time. Around the boats, the landing craft or assault landing craft that we were in, there would be the marshals' boats, the people that were conducting the training course, and they would be throwing small depth charges into the water near the boats. So the boats would be getting quite a bit of a shock at times, a wee bit of a shudder as these little depth charges went off. So it was as realistic as possible. Of course, in the night time there would be tracer bullets, and you'd be able to see the effect of all the tracers and everything, and it was quite an exciting thing to be on. We knew we were quite safe, really, as long as we didn't do anything silly, and the battle course there really prided itself on never having lost anyone. I know the Americans had a training course somewhere down in the south of England, a sort of live ammunition battleground that they put their men through, and they had a few casualties there. But the commando course in Scotland, they prided themselves on never having lost anyone. The other thing we did to the commandos was to give them what they called a wet landing, and this was more often prescribed than not for them. We would then land them, or not land them, really. We'd stop the boats before we got to the beach, and the commandos would have to jump off into fairly deep water. And I've seen some of the shorter commandos walking ashore, and all you could see would be their arms and their rifle held, or their small machine gun or whatever they had, being held aloft above the water. And you could see these two arms, like the sword Excalibur, advancing towards the beach. So they really got a wet landing. They were soaked right through. And they would have to then head up over the hills once they got through the barbed wire entanglements, past the landmines, etc., and all the guns that were firing at them. They had to make their way up over the hills. And very often they had very little food with them. They would have to live off the land, whatever they could find to eat. And they were trained to do that, of course. They had lectures on all the sorts of things that you could just eat from the trees or bushes around the place. The commandos would sometimes be away for 2 or 3 days, walking over the hills and finding their own way back to their base. The commando I remember up there, we put quite a lot of groups of commandos through this course. Of course, there was someone else actually conducting the course, and we were just there to facilitate the landing. But we talked to the commandos in between these sessions, and it was number 3 commando that said to us that the worst thing really was getting through the barbed wire. And so we cooked up this idea that we would make it easier for the commandos. Number 3 had been through the course several times until they were sick of it. And we'd been backwards and forwards with different groups, doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over until it was second nature to us. We decided we would get rid of the barbed wire. So a rope, one night on a landing, a rope was run up by the commandos and tied to the barbed wire, and one of our craft turned round and backed away and headed away from the beach at full speed ahead, and tore all the barbed wire entanglements and dragged them all down the beach. So the commandos got through that night very easily, and the landing craft crews of the Leopold were reprimanded for spoiling the exercise. Occasionally we had some free time, and we cruised up and down the islands there, past Carl, Egg and Muck, and we decided it would be a good thing to have some fresh fish. And we'd never used one of our depth charges, so we went fishing with one of the ship's depth charges. And of course there was a tremendous explosion from this depth charge after we dropped it. And then we lowered the boats and went round and collected all the fish. And a considerable quantity of fish was served for all the ship's crew after that. Another harebrained stunt that we got up to with the ship's officers was to go rabbit hunting. And we went ashore with the landing craft with machine guns. And it was a good thing that we didn't see any rabbits, I think, because there wouldn't have been much of the rabbit left if it had been hit by any of these machine guns. But we had a good walk through the heather and over the hills, but no rabbits. We were back in Oban swinging around the buoy, and with a bit of time to kill, There didn't seem to be any more commandos to train, but we were still held up there in case we were needed for that task. And we'd got friendly with some Australians who were up in Scotland exercising with Sunderland flying boats. And they were doing what they called circuits and bumps. They were flying their Sunderlands across the water at Oban and taking off and going round in a circuit and landing again. So circuits and bumps was really their practicing of takeoffs and landings. And we got quite friendly with these blokes. They came aboard and had a drink, and we met them ashore. And they said, how'd you like to go up with us one day? So a few of the officers from the Leopold went up, and I was one of them, and had the pleasure of flying in the Sunderland around. They took us around the islands, and we had quite a good view of the islands from the air, and a wee bit longer trip than they would normally do in those circuits and bumps. And we did a few landings and takeoffs and that sort of thing. Then I had a very pleasant surprise. It was decided that there was time to be able to give people who were Scots leave. They could have 4 days leave. And because my wife was in Scotland, I was given leave with the rest of the Scotsmen. Inverary, where Connie was only 40 miles from Oban. And I'd been in Oban for quite a while, and off and on, apart from the time away exercising. And I couldn't tell Connie where I was. And I couldn't even tell her that I was coming home because I didn't have a phone. So I arrived on the doorstep, and Connie's mother had gone to one of her daughters, and Connie and Gay were alone in the house. And of course I knocked on the door, having no key, and Connie came to the door, and it was marvellous to think that we had that time together. And she didn't think to ask me where I was, and I didn't even tell her that the ship was just that short distance away. But it was great to have those few days together. Whilst we had been in Southampton, I forgot to mention that Max Snyder came aboard, and he was a lieutenant colonel. He told us that he was doing everything he could to get the Leopold to land his Rangers, the 5th Rangers, in Normandy. He used his influence right up to the highest levels to endeavour to get the Leopold to do his landings. We were exercising with commandos, and of course we were expecting to be used with commandos. When we got back to Southampton again, Max was one of the first people to come aboard, and looking very, very happy and joyful. He was pleased to think that he'd finally achieved what he'd been trying to do, and the Leopold belonged to the Rangers again. The first job with the Rangers was to train, but not with the 5th Rangers. It was with the 2nd Rangers. Max wasn't with them. and we made our way down through the English Channel again and around to North Devon, and these rangers were training to climb cliffs, and so there were some suitable cliffs in North Devon, and we landed them at the foot of the cliffs, and they would fire these rockets which would take grappling hooks up over the edge of the cliff, and then they would scale up the ropes. And they practiced this time and time and time again. The second Rangers were freshly out of America. They had trained in America and then come over to the UK to be trained. They had no combat experience. The commanding officer really had no combat experience either. He was a Lieutenant Colonel Rudder. So Major Max Snyder had been appointed as executive officer of the 2nd Rangers, and he had the job of licking the 2nd Rangers into shape. Of course, then he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, Max was, and given the job of commanding the 5th Battalion of the American Rangers. Before Normandy, the 2nd and the 5th Ranger Battalions were combined and became known as the Provisional Ranger Group. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder was given command of the group, and Lieutenant Colonel Snyder was second in command,